When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, they pushed further and further into the Soviet Union. Now who'd ever thought that one day the Soviet Red Army would set foot on German soil? Well, it was the autumn of 1944 and it happened. This here is the story of the Soviet conquest of Eastern Germany and the end of the Eastern Front of World War II. Welcome to this video and welcome back at it again. If you're new, well, my name is Stefan, I'm a history teacher, I'm from the Netherlands and I'm hustling history for you. And if you like that, then please consider subscribing, and if you do so, do not forget to hit that notification bell to join the hustle. In the previous video, I explained you about the end of the Western Front, how the Allies took the western parts of Germany. At the end of the Second World War, 3/4 of the German army were fighting on the Eastern Front. In this video I'll talk about how the Soviets conquered the eastern parts of Germany. But the thing is, what was the German homeland? Because Germany's borders have shifted a lot. It was Prussia at the end of the 18th century that carved up the remaining parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 1871, the German Empire was established. But then, after the First World War, Germany lost territory. In this video, I will focus on the post-World War I borders. And of course, I'm aware that Breslau is now Wrocław and that Köningsberg is now Kaliningrad. But because at the end of the First World War and even at the end of the Second World War, there are mostly Germans living in these cities, I consider them, in this video, German as such. And that brings me to the Soviet conquest of East Prussia. After the colossal Soviet breakthrough during Operation Bagration, which led to the destruction of Army Group Center, the Soviets came closer and closer to the German homeland. In August 1944, residents of the border area were allowed to evacuate. They later returned. Yet, the first Soviet incursion would happen early October 1944, when the Soviets poured into Mammeland in the north. Mid-October, the Soviets launched another attack. Around that time, the Volkssturm was also established. In the previous video, I elaborated on this army formation. It was a last-ditch army that consisted of men that weren't conscripted yet between the ages of 16 and 60. There was a severe lack of uniforms and weaponry, and therefore most soldiers of the Volkssturm fought in civilian clothing and were provided with just an armband. And as for weaponry, well, they had old weapons from the First World War, as well as captured rifles, French, Dutch, Italian, as well as new, simply manufactured weapons like the Volkssturmgewehr and the Einstoßflammenwerfer 46. Several days later, the Soviets broke through all the way to a village called Nemesdorf. Well, soon this village was retaken by the German army, and the Germans made a horrible discovery. They found 26 bodies, among them some children and some older people. Most of them were shot to the head. German Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, he used this tragic event to rally the German people behind the concept of fighting till the last man against the Bolshevik hordes. Between November and January, there was a lull in the fighting. After this, the Soviets continued their advance. Soviet General Ivan Chernyakhovsky noticed that the German forces near Insterburg were strong, so he performed an attack at Tilsit in the north and therefore attacked the Germans in the rear. Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky attacked at Allenstein. With his tank forces, General Vasily Volsky bypassed Elbing, therefore largely cutting off East Prussia. Even at this point, Gauleiter, district leader Erich Koch, refused the full evacuation of East Prussian civilians. Many civilians went anyway. Retreating German troops warned civilians to leave immediately. Some civilians took the train from Königsberg to Allenstein, thinking they escaped. But since Allenstein was taken by the Soviets, they ended up in the hands of the Red Army with brutal consequences. German men and boys were murdered, and girls and women were raped. There was one possible escape via land, via the Friesche Näherung, it's now called the Vistula Spit. In order to reach this land, many fleeing civilians crossed the frozen lagoon while being under fire by Soviet artillery and aircrafts. Fleeing columns were fired upon by the Soviets, and those who got hit were lost. Those who fell through the ice were lost. The East Prussian capital city of Königsberg was surrounded, and 100,000 German civilians found themselves trapped in the city that was declared a fortress and had to hold out till the last man. A horrible battle followed, and eventually Königsberg would surrender on the 10th of April 1945. In Zamland, the Germans would fight till the end of that month. Georgy Zhukov's first Belarusian front passed through Poland. They passed a pile of rubble that once was a city named Warsaw, a city that was systematically destroyed by the Germans after the brave but failed Warsaw Uprising by the Polish resistance, in which the Soviets did not provide assistance. Mid-January, the Soviets captured Łódź, and also Krakow was taken. Krakow, unlike Warsaw, was spared from total destruction. At the end of that month, Auschwitz was also liberated by the Soviets. Around that time, the Polish city of Poznan was besieged. The siege would last till February. The Soviets poured into Silesia, and soon the Siege of Breslau started. This siege would last till after the surrender of Berlin. The Soviets reached the Oder River and bypassed many German units and endured some pitched battles here and there. The speed of advance of the 1st and 2nd Guard tank armies towards the Oder was protected on their right flank by another 4 armies spread out across southern Pomerania. Their greatest problem was not German resistance, but the difficulties of their supply services, desperately trying to keep up with them on bad winter roads and without any rail line functioning. Had it not been for the American trucks provided under Lend-Lease, the Red Army would never have made it to Berlin before the Americans. On January 30th, Zhukov's tanks reached the Oder River and made several bridgeheads. The German losses of January 1945 were sky high. We're talking about 450,000 men dead. That is more than the losses of the American army in the entirety of the Second World War. On February 3rd, another air raid was carried out by the Americans, this time on Berlin, resulting in 3,000 casualties. Was the capital of the Reich for the taking? The Soviets could have marched on Berlin. However, this would leave their flanks dangerously exposed in North Pomerania and the South Silesia. So therefore the Soviets decided to deal with these flanks first. A German counterattack with tanks at Stargard named Operation Solstice turned into a 2-day disaster because of the lack of fuel and the sudden thaw, which turned the roads into muddy swamps. Rokossovsky made an advance west of the Vistula River towards Danzig. Zhukov sent his forces towards the coast east of Stettin. Some Wehrmacht units managed to slip through the lines by sneaking through the forest and therefore managing to make their way west. The Soviets' advances created German pockets at the Prussian coast. At the ports of Danzig and Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, countless German refugees had gathered, hoping to be evacuated. Till the last moment, the Germans tried to fight off the Soviets in order to make an evacuation possible for women and children. Even within these pockets, the German field police patrolled and killed any suspected deserters. As a senior Red Army officer observed, morale is low, but discipline is strong. Danzig fell on March 30th. Königsberg surrendered on April 10th. The Zamland pocket was stormed April 25th, and Berlin laid ahead. Berliners prepared for the onslaught with foreboding. Women were offered pistol shooting practice. Trams and railway goods wagons filled with stone and rubble were maneuvered into place, pavements were ripped up, and individual foxholes dug for men and boys armed with Panzerfaust launchers. Housewives laid in what supplies they could, and they boiled water to be kept in preserving jars for drinking when the taps ran dry. Teenage members of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, a paramilitary labor force, were inducted en masse into the army. Many of them were forced to witness executions. "To accustom you to death," an officer told them. And death was sure to come. Now, before entering Berlin, the Soviets had to fight the Germans on the Zilo Heights. On April 16, around 9,000 Soviet guns, mortars and Katyushkas fired on the German positions. Around 150 searchlights were used to dazzle the enemy. The attack did not went smooth from the beginning, but after several days the Soviets broke through with a high price: 30,000 deaths with 20,000 Germans killed in action. Zhukov cared little and had his eyes on the prize, and that was Berlin. In the aftermath of the battle, the German 9th Army got surrounded at Halbe and fought a bloody battle to break out in order to surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviets. Around 25,000 soldiers managed to do so. A higher number of Germans got killed in a desperate operation. Further south, the Germans fought against the Soviets and Polish forces at the Battle of Bautzen and were victorious. But this was a small victory compared to the ocean of defeat. On April 20th, it was Adolf Hitler's birthday, and he was greeted by an Allied bombing. The following day, the Allied bombing stopped to make way for Soviet artillery. On April 23rd, Helmut Weitling, German general who was previously condemned to death for cowardice, made a firm stance against the charges that were laid on him and was now named as commander of the armed forces at Berlin. He seemed to have said, yeah, you could just as well have shot me. It's like the absurdity we're in at the end of this war. As Soviet tanks entered Berlin via the southeast, they came into heavy fighting with SS Nordland. On the 24th, troops of Soviet General Ivan Konev attacked the Tento Canal. House-to-house fighting followed as the Soviets fought against fanatical members of the SS, the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth that were ordered to fight till the last man or boy. The Soviets used their anti-aircraft guns to clear the roofs of enemy fire, since they were continuously being harassed from there. The Germans flew in reinforcements. Karl Dönitz sent armed sailors by plane, and also French volunteers of the SS Charlemagne made it to Berlin. These are like some really odd volunteers, don't you think? I mean, first of all, sailors that were flown in. I mean, normally you think sailors are on a boat, but okay, I understand. And then there are also French volunteers defending the capital of Germany. It's once again these levels of absurdity we have reached at the end of this terrible war. Meanwhile, Berliners waited anxious in their cellars for the battle to be over. Some citizens hung out white sheets to say that they surrendered to Soviet forces with the risk of being killed by German death squads that were ordered to kill any suspected deserter that did not fight till the bitter end. And as the Berliners soon find out, the Soviets were not that much of a relief. Although the Soviet vengeance would not reach the levels of brutality as it had done in East Prussia, many women were raped by the Red Army. And I'm not only talking about German women, also Jewish women that were still in Berlin somehow were victim of these types of brutality. Heck, even Soviet women that have been captured by the Germans, put to slave labor, once they were liberated by their comrades, this is what happened. And then there were also German communists that as soon as the Soviets had reached them, they came out and offered their help. But they were seen as traitors and deported. I don't know what to make of this. Perhaps this is like the bitter irony of communism, that everybody is equal under the red banner, well, equal as suspicious, and therefore deserves the same treatment. it's just plain sad. On April 27, the Soviets broke through the German defenses at the Landwehr Canal and were now near the government district. On April 29, Hitler wrote his testament and named Admiral Dönitz as his successor as President of the Reich. Adolf Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun, took their lives on April 30th. Joseph Goebbels and his wife did so on May 1st. The fall of Berlin was a fact on May 2nd. Breslau surrendered on May 6th. And on May 8th, the German forces unconditionally surrendered. World War II in Europe was over. Hey, thanks to my Patreons, and a special thanks to Henry Clarkson, Michael Mozart, Wombat Cookie, and if you want to support me, you go to the link right here. Do not forget to like, to comment, and to share Facebook, Reddit, Twitter. If you want to know more about the Allied conquest, the Allied conquest of the western parts of Germany, you can click right here. If you want to know more about the aftermath of World War II, you can click right here. Thank you so much for watching. That was it for now. See you later.